difficult times and change everything in times of great crisis and wars. Heroes can sometimes win great victories in the Ukrainian army. One hero changed everything. Breathtaking war stories are quite extraordinary. Our team has been researching for a long time to get this special information. Please watch this video carefully. You can use the super thanks button below the video to support our team for their hard work to create this news. Let's start if you are ready. Eugene was a very successful student. He was looking forward to serving his country after he finished school, but when he graduated, his country was in a crisis. Eugene wanted to defend his country against the Russian invasion, so he joined the army. His military service was very successful and he was quickly promoted. When Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, Eugene was one of the most successful lieutenants in the Ukrainian army. After the Russian army advanced into Ukraine, thousands of Ukrainians volunteered to join the army. Eugene's father, Oleg, was one of them. When Oleg's deployment was announced, it was an emotional moment for both of them. It was assigned to the 92nd Mechanized Brigade of the Army, named after the 17th century Cossack military leader Ivan Surkov. The commander of this brigade was Oleg. Successful son Eugene, father and son were on the same front trying to resist the Russian invasion. They participated in many operations together. In these operations, they won many victories against the Russian army in the battles they fought together. They managed to liberate 3 towns from occupation. These operations were very emotional for them, but it was even more emotional for the woman waiting for them at home. Alex's wife and Eugene's mother were waiting for them at home. She was very worried, but also very proud. She kept praying that her husband and son would come home. When this war was over, Oleg and Eugene thought of her. In every battle on the field, the Ukrainian army's liberation of Kupiansk was marked by very difficult battles. As a result of this operation, the Ukrainian army was successful. The Russian army suffered many casualties during the operation. Lieutenant Eugene played a big role in this operation. He saved the lives of many soldiers with a decision he made. During this operation, Ukrainian soldiers were advancing with tanks when the Russian army launched a missile attack. As these missiles targeted the tanks, Lieutenant Eugene made a critical decision. The tanks of the Ukrainian army advanced into the woods. Here, 3 tanks moved between the trees. Ukrainian soldiers had dug a very big holes in these trees. In fact, this hole was dug to shoot down the Russian tanks. But Eugene made a clever decision to drop the Ukrainian army tanks into the hole, which allowed the soldiers to escape the missile attack, but they were trapped inside the tanks for hours. Ukrainian army reinforcements arrived and destroyed the Russian missiles. After that, the tanks in the pit were brought up and the soldiers were rescued. By taking this decision, Eugene saved all 3 tanks and the soldiers inside. One of the soldiers was his father. The lieutenant's great success and strategy in this operation was appreciated by Ukrainian commanders. Lieutenant Eugene was considered a hero in the Ukrainian army. In another battle, he managed to kill 16 Russian soldiers with a machine gun. He became a legend for this feat in combat. Ukrainian soldiers had great admiration for the lieutenant. The lieutenant liberated many regions and saved dozens of soldiers' lives. But in one operation, things did not go his way. In the town of Piatakotki, there was a big battle against the Russian army. Many Russian soldiers were killed in the hours of fighting, but the Russian army was joined by new recruits from the other front. Among the ammunition brought by the new soldiers were rockets. The first person who saw that the Russian army was going to launch a rocket attack was Oleg. The father of Lieutenant Oleg was a retired colonel from the Ukrainian army. He was very good with machine guns and sniper rifles. He was a sniper during this operation, but the scope of his rifle, he was following all the movements of the Russian soldiers and killing them one by one. While looking through the scope, he noticed two Russian soldiers holding rockets. He immediately fired and killed one of the Russian soldiers, but the other soldier was out of sight. Oleg realized that this soldier was going to fire a missile and warn the other soldiers. At that moment, he dropped his gun and ran towards his son. As soon as the Russian soldiers fired the rocket, Oleg jumped on his son, Eugene. The young lieutenant fell to the ground with his father. Immediately after the rocket explosion, Eugene opened his eyes. Shrapnel from the rocket had caught his face. He felt great pain. He immediately wanted to stand up and shoot, but he could not move because his father was on top of him and not moving at all. The young lieutenant realized that his father was dead. As he slowly lowered his father to the ground, he noticed the shrapnel in his back. Retired Colonel Oleg had saved young Lieutenant Eugene's life. Eugene kept fighting despite his father's death. He picked up the sniper rifle. His father had left him and started shooting Russian soldiers one by one. Eugene was shooting like his father. Russian soldiers couldn't dodge his bullets. The Ukrainian army managed to win this battle, too, but the young lieutenant was saddened by the loss of his father. Eugene's moment affected all Ukrainian soldiers. Now everyone in the Ukrainian army knew the story of the lieutenant and his father. It was so reported in the press. The Ukrainian press reported dozens of stories about Eugene's achievements. The young lieutenant became one of the most popular people in Ukraine. This also caught the attention of Zelensky. Zelensky decided to do something about it. Hero of Ukraine is the highest national title that can be awarded to a citizen by the President of Ukraine. It has been awarded in special cases since 1998. President Zelensky of Ukraine decided to give the award to Lieutenant Eugene at a special ceremony. When Eugene received the award, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Valery Zaluzhny, a close friend of his father, was applauding him. It was a very emotional moment for both of them. When Eugene received this award, the scars of his face had not yet disappeared. These scars on his face were very impressive for the whole Ukrainian people. Everyone who watched the ceremony was convinced that Eugene was a real hero. Eugene's extraordinary story touched the people of Ukraine. Solidarity in the country grew even more. The young lieutenant not only won victories on the battlefield, but also increased the solidarity of his people. Even soldiers in the Russian army followed the news of Eugene's great heroes and with interest. The young lieutenant became one of the symbols of this war. Vladimir Putin is withdrawing his troops from Ukrainian territory. A red alert has been issued in the Kremlin palace after the pro-Ukrainian Russian Freedom Legion soldiers captured the Russian city of Belgorod by order of Vladimir Putin. 25,000 Russian troops are withdrawing from Ukrainian territory. In the past days, pro-Ukrainian soldiers of the Russian Freedom Legion managed to infiltrate into Russia and captured 3 different towns in the city of Belgorod on the Russian border with Ukraine. The war that has been going on for 16 months in Ukraine has now officially spread to Russia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has decided to withdraw nearly 25,000 Russian troops from Ukrainian territory to ensure the security of the city of Belgorod. Before getting into the details of the news, let's give a brief information about the operation that led to Putin's decision to withdraw soldiers of the Russian Freedom Legion who have been fighting against Russian forces and the Russian border city of Ukraine for a long time. Neutralized Russian soldiers in a town in Kharkov. Ukrainian soldiers who captured Russian soldiers in the Chai region of Kharkov managed to infiltrate the Russian borders with an interesting strategy. Wearing the uniforms of the soldiers they captured, Ukrainian soldiers moved smoothly to the city of Belgorod on the Russian border. Ukrainian soldiers who organized separate operations in 3 different towns in Belgorod managed to push back the Russian forces there. The Belgorod regional governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov, declared a state of emergency in the region and requested military support, stating that the situation has gotten very bad and Ukrainian soldiers continue to advance. Gladkov announced that they have started evacuating civilians. Russian troops stationed in the city of Belgorod were unable to stop the advance of pro-Ukrainian troops. Thus, on the orders of Vladimir Putin, it was planned to withdraw Russian troops from Kharkiv to Belgorod. Acting on Putin's order, Russian General Valery Gerasimov withdrew nearly 25,000 Russian troops from the city of Kharkiv. The hot clashes that have been going on in the Russian city of Belgorod for several days have been closely followed by the Kremlin palace. The Ukrainian army has not only deployed troops here, but also military equipment such as helicopters and unmanned combat drones. The Russian army's loss of control here poses a major threat to Putin. The statements made by the commander of the pro-Ukrainian Russian Free Legion, which managed to capture the region, have caused Putin to be even more afraid. In his statement, the Ukrainian commanders stated that they have taken action to end the Putin regime and to regain Russia's freedom, and that they will continue to advance on Russian territory. Following the Ukrainian commander's statement, General Valery Gerasimov begun moving Russian troops from Belgorod to towns near the city center. However, these troops were not enough. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army continued its operations against the occupying Russian troops in the city of Kharkiv. The Ukrainian army's deployment of troops in Belgorod caused the Russian troops in Kharkiv to be squeezed. Thus, Putin decided to withdraw nearly 25,000 Russian troops from Kharkiv. The withdrawal of the Russian forces in Kharkiv, which had been under the control of the Russian army for a long time, was an unmissable opportunity for the Ukrainian army. However, the real reason for the withdrawal of these troops was to push back the Ukrainian troops stationed in Belgorod. General Gerasimov was willing to sacrifice the city of Kharkiv to save Belgorod. Now, more than 25,000 Russian troops are joining the Russian troops stationed in Belgorod. These troops are expected to soon launch an offensive against Ukrainian towns captured by the Ukrainian army. Even if the Ukrainian army withdraws from Belgorod, most of Kharkiv, which has been under Russian occupation for months, is now under Ukrainian control. Thus, the Ukrainian army was able to profit from this operation in every way. The Russian people are very afraid by the sudden spread of the war to Russia's borders. Fear and panic have gripped the citizens living in the Russian city of Belgorod, the border region of Russia and Ukraine. The successive operations of the Ukrainian army against the Russian forces have further frightened the Russian citizens in Belgorod. Russian troops occupying Ukrainian territory had to retreat to the city of Belgorod when they lost these fronts. And the Russian people who saw the Russian troops retreating here became even more worried with the withdrawal of the Russian troops. Citizens who think that the war will spread to the borders of Russia are now in a panic. But it seems that this is not the only reason. According to the statements of investigative journalists who went to the city of Belgorod with the withdrawal of Russian troops, there is great unrest in Belgorod. Vladimir Putin's soldiers are roaming the streets of Belgorod, and more Russian troops are arriving in Belgorod every day. Many Ukrainian citizens have also flocked to Belgorod because of the war. The locals in Belgorod are very disturbed by the influx of Ukrainians and the constant power outages in the city at the moment. Education in Belgorod, near the border with Ukraine, has completely stopped. Schools in areas close to the border have been temporarily closed. With the increase in the number of Russian soldiers in the city of Belgorod, there is no lack of fights and noise. Russian soldiers are currently not on any mission, and locals are disturbed by the fact that these soldiers are constantly drinking alcohol and fighting among themselves. While the situation in Belgorod is like this, the promise made by Russian President Vladimir Putin has lost its effect after invading Ukrainian territory. Putin said that he would allow Ukrainian citizens in the occupied territories to come to the city of Belgorod and enter the borders of Russia, and that these people would be given a certain amount of money. After Putin's words, many Ukrainian citizens who did not want to be caught in the middle of the war flocked to the city of Belgorod. But Putin decided to close the Belgorod border gates due to the unrest in Belgorod and the large number of refugees. The Russian army has stopped the entry to the city. Ukrainian citizens queuing for kilometers at the Belgorod border crossing do not yet know what to do. While Putin continues to deceive people by not keeping his promises to these people he has made homeless. Since the beginning of the war, Putin has been sending Russian officials to the occupied regions of Ukraine to issue Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens. Putin's main goal is to hold an official referendum in the future to make the annexation of these cities accepted by the whole world. Currently, Putin has annexed Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk and Kherson, regions of Ukraine. However, this annexation decision is not recognized by almost any country. For this reason, Putin plans to organize an official referendum in these regions at a later date. What Putin needs for this plan is more Russian citizens. The Russian leader is sending Russian citizens to these annexed regions every month. Russian citizens agree to live in these occupied territories in exchange for promises such as regular monthly salaries, land and houses. While Putin is reducing the number of Ukrainian citizens here, he is increasing the number of Russian citizens he sends. Thus, in a referendum to be organized, more votes would be cast for the annexation of these regions to Russia. However, according to the information currently available, Putin is unable to meet the needs of the Russian citizens he has sent to Ukraine. It is quite normal for these citizens to be short of supplies when even the Russian army has a huge shortage of weapons and ammunition. The workers sent to Ukraine by Putin have already started striking. Putin sent many Russian workers to Ukraine to rebuild the occupied territories. However, these workers have stopped working. Allegedly, the Russian government is not paying their salaries, so thousands of workers have decided to strike. Ukraine is about to enter Crimea at this point. The war has completed its first year and the Ukrainian army has gained the superiority of the war. Excess ammunition expenditure of the Russian army, the inability of offensive operations to pass the steel curtain of the Ukrainian defense, and heavy losses demoralize the Russian soldiers. In addition, the Ukrainian offensive that began last autumn, returning 70% of the Russian-controlled areas to Ukraine, is one of the main reasons for the Ukrainian army to gain the upper hand. Now, Ukraine, with the self-confidence of the psychological and physical superiority, is much closer to its ultimate goal, Crimea. This rapprochement has been felt more clearly in the attacks of the Ukrainian army against Russian elements in Crimea in recent months. Before the Ukrainian army launches its offensive against Crimea, it wants to weaken the Russian forces there and to deal with this matter as quickly as possible. So important points of the Russians are hit. One by one, the Ukrainian army, which has increased its offensive operations over Crimea in recent weeks, attacked one of the largest air bases in Crimea yesterday in the Saki region of Crimea. A Ukrainian attack aircraft equipped with the Iridium system was shot down. It was announced that air defense systems were put into operation on the territory of Crimea yesterday afternoon. As it turned out, the reason for this was another attack from Ukraine, and the Ukrainian army conducted an offensive operation against one of the largest military air bases on the peninsula, sending at least one drone to destroy the military airspace in Saki. In the images recorded by the locals, it was revealed that the Ukrainian UAVs were equipped with an Iridium global positioning system. According to experts, in this way, the Ukrainian army tried to circumvent the operation of electronic warfare equipment, and this work gave the best results. It was not specified how strong the Ukrainian drone's payload was, but such attacks on the peninsula are an indication that the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to neutralize the air defense of Crimea. In addition, an explosion occurred near the village of Perevalnoye in the Simferopol district in Crimea, where the Coastal Defense Brigade of Russia's Black Sea Fleet is deployed. The other day, locals reported an explosion in Perevalnoye. The 126 separate Guards, Coast Guard Brigade of the Black Sea Fleet is stationed here and is among the first reports that some ships were damaged due to the explosion. So what is Russia doing in Crimea for a possible Ukrainian attack? The Russian military is reportedly strengthening the defenses of Crimea amid news that Ukraine's Western allies are starting to warm up to retaking Crimea after nearly a decade of Russian control. The main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian armed forces claimed that the military intelligence in the region showed that the forces on the peninsula were constantly ready for war, while in some sectors, Russian forces were seen excavating. The main intelligence directorate of Ukraine constantly monitors everything related to the activities of the military group in the temporarily occupied Crimea. They are preparing for defensive actions on the peninsula. Infrastructure is kept ready for war. These infrastructures are powerful land and aviation components located on the territory of Crimea. It is estimated that Russia has about 90 aircraft and 60 combat helicopters in Crimea. Many of these claims were echoed by officials who revived satellite imagery that showed Russian forces continuing to build defensive fortifications in southern Ukraine along the border with Crimea. Satellite images also show that Russian forces have increased the number of barriers and trenches along roads to occupied Crimea in Kherson Oblast over the past few months. The allegations came amid claims by Ukrainian officials that Ukraine, among Western allies, is warming to the idea of crossing Russian President Vladimir Putin's red line and retaking Ukraine's disputed region of Crimea. Earlier this week, it was reported that Ukraine's effort to retake the peninsula will not raise the same problems. Some who believe in Russia's ability to wage an offensive war in Ukraine. There are reports from Western leaders that if Ukraine returns to Crimea, there will be an inevitable escalation that could even lead to a nuclear conflict. The rhetoric has been changing ever since it became increasingly clear what Crimea is, what it means for Russia, and how things are connected around Crimea. The war led to referendums similar to those held in the Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions in the Crimea before and their subsequent annexation by Moscow. These referenda were widely condemned by the international community, describing them as fraudulent by European countries and the United States. Since then, Russia has withdrawn to the left bank of the Dnipro River, leaving the administrative center of the Kherson region, but continues to control the direct land connection to the Crimea. Kherson, located in the north of the Crimean Peninsula, is of great importance for Crimea, which suffered from water shortages after it was annexed due to its water resources. Well, let's take a look at the behind the scenes of the Crimea incident. 9 years have passed since Russia's annexation of Ukraine's Crimea region, and since the start of the Moscow-Kyiv war more than a year ago, Russia has controlled more than 15% of Ukraine. Protests broke out in Ukraine's capital, Kiev, on November 21, 2013, after the country's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, refused to sign an association agreement with the EU. After Yanukovych's resignation, who could not stand the protests, pro-Western politicians took over the administration in Kiev, while military units from the Russian base in Crimea became visible in various cities of the country. Despite violating the agreement signed between Kiev and Moscow in 1997 and 2010 on the location of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, Russian troops eventually entered the peninsula. Pro-Russians began to pressure the Ukrainian parliament for the annexation of Crimea by Russia. On February 25, 2014, and nearly 400 pro-Russians demanded a referendum to declare Crimea's independence, which blocked access to the regional parliament. 2 days later, gunmen in green military uniforms masked button marked began to take control of public buildings. The Little Green Men, as they were described later, began to drive Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians away from the peninsula. Amid the decision of the Crimean parliament to hold a referendum on the annexation of the region to Russia, despite the objections of the Crimean Tatars and the boycott of the parliamentary decision, A so-called referendum was held in the region on March 16, 2014, and its results supported the annexation of Crimea. International organizations, especially the UN and many countries such as Turkey, opposed the referendum and found it illegal, while Russia recognized the referendum. Pressure on the Crimean Tatars increased shortly after the illegal annexation of Crimea, with events of about 10,000 confronting a pro-Russian separatist group. The rights of the Crimean Tatars began to be violated, and many people were arrested, and the Crimean Tatar Assembly was included in the list of extremist organizations by Moscow. Finally, some of the initial attacks of the war within the scope of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine were made over Crimea. Meanwhile, around 70% of the Zaporizhia region, where there is still intense conflict, including the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear power plant, is under the control of Russian forces. Both Kherson and Zaporizhia regions are of key importance for Russia in maintaining its road link with Crimea through the Donbass region. Therefore, the Ukrainian army must clear the Russian presence in these regions and smooth the road to Crimea before launching the Crimean offensive.